He's working in Zimbabwe now. He wants to knock out malaria in his home country. That's his life goal. So I'll close by talking about some of our work in science diplomacy as part of the AAAS. And I won't talk about our work in Myanmar, Tunisia, Lebanon, or Iran. I'll concentrate on our work in Cuba, where things are going extremely well. We've been visiting recurrently since 2009. In North Korea, for over the same interval, we've visited repeatedly with little progress. So there's still signs of the revolution in Cuba, and because of the liberalization of the interpretation of the guidelines, I'm sure many of you present here have been to Cuba. I encourage you to do so. And because of the embargo, which is a very bitter issue with the Cubans, the lack of import has led to the preservation of some of these old cars. But I can assure you, the average car in the street of Havana does not look pristine like this '56 Chevy. And they have a fairly good tourist industry. That's their #1 source of economic income. I did not smoke this cigar, I have to point out. And where there has been investment, the colonial architecture is pristine, but where there has not been investment, things are crumbling. So after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Cuba has gone it alone with huge economic hardship. But they focused on science in terms of medical techniques to prevent illness, development of vaccines. Now, scientific collaboration for Cuba didn't just start. This is a photograph of a painting in Havana of the Walter Reed Yellow Fever Commission from 1900. Walter Reed is shown in the white uniform in the center, and in the far right is Carlos Findlay, a Cuban medical doctor who was the first to conceive of the idea that mosquitoes would transmit yellow fever from one patient to another. It was commonly assumed to be from refuge or swamp gas or some other explanation. And in the Yellow Fever Commission in 1900, the Americans working alongside the Cubans pursued this hypothesis by being guinea pigs. Shown in the blue uniform, I think he's standing second from the left, is James Carroll from the University of Maryland. And standing in the brown uniform to the far left is Jesse Lazier from Johns Hopkins. And Carroll and Lazier both volunteered to be bitten by yellow fever mosquitoes that had been feasting on yellow fever patients. And Carroll became very severely ill but recovered, and Lazier died. But it was that work that was the proof that led to the understanding that yellow fever is a mosquito-borne disease. And because of that, they were able to control and eliminate yellow fever from Cuba. And that same hypothesis is at work still with the passage of dengue fever, chikungunya, and now Zika. So mosquitoes are not our friends. Molecular analyses and laboratories are looking for techniques to make them resistant to the passages of these bad viruses. So a plaque that we placed on the wall of the State Academy of Science in Havana in February, if you look in the second line, it's in honor of the Cuban physician, Carlos Findlay, and the American physician, Jesse Lazier, for their work in 1900. Now, it's hard to talk about Cuba without talking about this individual. I was most fortunate to spend an evening with Fidel Castro 3 years ago. Alan Roebuck from Rutgers and I were invited and had a conversation that went on for 3.5 hours. To say a conversation is a bit misleading. 99% of the talking was you-know-who. And he talks like this, and he talks like this. But then he allowed us to ask him some questions. And being a medical scientist and a physician, I asked about the role of medicine as an explanation for the Cuban Revolution. And Fidel Castro conceded that, in fact, medical care was a major reason for the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro was the son of a wealthy landowner. His mother was a peasant maid who worked in the villa. So he was illegitimate. And because of his father's wealth, he saw what the rich people experienced, and from his mother's poverty, what the poor experienced. There was no health care for poor people in Cuba before the revolution. Everything was cash. Half the physicians lived in Havana. And with the revolution, of course, half of the Cuban physicians fled to the United States. So they had to start over. And they first wanted to make healthcare universal, which it is now, and it's led to some remarkable improvements. The infant mortality statistics for Cuba are consistently better than many American cities. The average lifespan in Cuba is equivalent to the United States. They also focused on developing of vaccines, the prevention of disease. So it was kind of eye-opening for me. And at the end of the evening, oops, I'm pushing the wrong button here. At the end of the evening, while there were many things which we didn't disagree upon, the role of science in improving the lives of the people and the ability of science to open doors is something which we very happily agreed upon. And just last week, his grandson, Fidel Castro Smirnov, visited Johns Hopkins on his way to the American Chemical Society meeting. And this week, his son, Fidel Castro Diaz-Balart, will visit Johns Hopkins to talk about physics. So the world is improving, and I think science can lead the way. Now, the Cuban universities are very much strapped for resources, but the University of Havana is a very lovely venue. I lectured there a number of times, and invariably, the podium was stormed after the lecture. Now, I don't expect you to do that to me today, but these young scientists are not ideologically driven. They're young scientists with curiosity. They want to come to the United States to do research, to develop their careers. And I think the opportunities will soon be possible for them to come here. Only good things can come from this. So I'll end by speaking about North Korea. Just for curiosity, do you mind if I ask, has anybody here been to North Korea? One. You're the first man who's raised his hand when I've asked that at a number of lectures. It's not easy to get there. You have to probably have a good reason to go there. And there are challenges, but how else are you going to experience what's really on the ground? In some ways, Pyongyang, which is the cultural center, the capital, looks pretty well taken care of, but it reminds me a bit of the Twilight Zone. It looks real, but there's something that's unreal about it. The streets are relatively empty, and the notion is widely spread that Juche, self-reliance,